We arrived in the small village nestled in the rolling hills of Vermont, where the old houses stood quietly, surrounded by greenery. The sunlight reflected off the windows, casting a golden glow on the scene, making everything seem warm and peaceful. But as we rolled through the narrow streets, a strange tension began to build inside me. The charm of the village was undeniable, yet I felt a creeping discomfort, a quiet restlessness. Jake, who had been driving, was absorbed in his phone, his fingers flicking over the screen, responding to messages. The soft glow from the phone illuminated his face in the fading light, but it only made me feel more isolated. I had always disliked how distracted he could get when we were together. Meanwhile, my mom was talking animatedly about the upcoming anniversary celebration with Kevin, her words flowing easily, like they always did. Their relationship appeared perfect, a well-oiled machine of affection and shared memories. But there was something different today, something I couldn't quite place. Kevin's voice, though warm, seemed tired, and his responses were getting shorter as if he was starting to retreat into himself. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, trying to read his face, but all I saw was the back of his head. He always had an air of calm about him, but this time, the easygoing charm seemed more like a mask. His tired eyes betrayed something deeper, something unspoken, and I could feel it in the silence between us. We drove through the village, past old stone walls, the green hills stretching in every direction. The serenity of the place should have put me at ease, but instead, I felt myself retreating into my own thoughts. I wondered why I couldn't shake this sense of discomfort. Was it just the overwhelming peace of the place? Or was it something else? Something about this trip felt like it was unraveling a thread I didn't even know was there, and I wasn't sure I was ready to follow it. We stopped in front of one of the old houses, its ivy-covered walls standing like a silent witness to decades of life that had passed within. Kevin stepped out of the car first, stretching his long legs before moving to grab our bags. His movements were smooth and practiced, but something in the way he looked at me, just a little too long, a little too intense, caught me off guard. It was only a second, but I felt it, a flicker of something that wasn't there before. I stepped out of the car, trying to shake the odd sensation that had settled in my chest. The soft fabric of my dress brushed against my legs as I walked to the house, the cool air of the evening brushing over my skin. The moment felt so normal, yet the quiet attention Kevin paid to me made it feel anything but. I glanced back at him, our eyes meeting for the briefest of moments, and I felt a jolt of unease. He wasn't looking at me like he usually did, with the casual ease of a friend. There was a subtle weight in his gaze, a lingering that unsettled me. Later, after we'd settled in and had a light lunch, Kevin suggested a walk. "There's a trail up to the hill," he said, his voice slow, almost hesitant. "I think you'd like it. The view is incredible." I agreed, even though the last thing I wanted was to be alone with him. There was something about the way he asked that made me feel like I had no choice. As we walked down the quiet path, the sound of leaves crunching beneath our feet seemed louder than usual, echoing in the stillness. We spoke about trivial things at first, the weather, the landscape, the kind of small talk you make to avoid silences. But as we continued, the conversation shifted, and Kevin began to open up in a way that surprised me. "I sometimes wonder about the choices I've made," he said, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. "I'm not sure if I've done the right things in my life." He glanced at me as we walked, his eyes briefly meeting mine, and there it was again, an intensity I couldn't explain. I didn't know how to respond. Was he confessing to me? Was I supposed to give him advice? I wasn't sure, but it felt as though his words were aimed at something deeper, something unspoken. My heart pounded in my chest, and the light breeze that had once felt refreshing now seemed cold. The air between us was thick with tension. I forced myself to keep walking, but I could feel his presence beside me, always just a little too close. We reached the top of the hill, and Kevin stood still, looking out over the valley. His posture was relaxed, but his gaze remained distant, as though he wasn't really seeing anything at all. I tried to push away the feeling that this moment, this seemingly innocent walk, was beginning to change something inside me, something I wasn't ready to confront. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he asked softly. I nodded, though I couldn't shake the feeling that the landscape wasn't the only thing he was trying to share with me. I wanted to turn away, to escape from whatever this was, but his words had already planted a seed of doubt. What was really going on between us? The next morning came too quickly. The light through the window crept in early, casting a soft glow over the room. I woke up earlier than I had planned, my mind restless, tangled in the events of the day before. My eyes wandered over the unfamiliar walls, the wooden beams overhead, and I couldn't help but feel the weight of the quiet house pressing down on me. I could hear faint sounds from downstairs, Kevin's steady movements, the soft clink of utensils, the rustling of paper as someone moved about. I slipped out of bed and padded quietly toward the kitchen. The moment I stepped into the hallway, I caught sight of Kevin. He was at the stove, carefully flipping pancakes, his movements methodical. He looked completely at ease in the kitchen, his hands moving with practiced grace. I paused for a moment in the doorway, watching him before he turned and saw me standing there. "Good morning," he said with a smile, his voice warm but neutral. "Good morning," I replied, my voice sounding quieter than usual. Something in the air felt charged, and I didn't know how to navigate it. The previous day still lingered like a heavy fog in my mind. Kevin motioned toward the counter. "Help yourself to some coffee," he offered. I nodded and went to pour myself a cup, trying to ground myself in the mundane act of making coffee, but my thoughts kept returning to him. I sat down at the table, stirring the coffee absent-mindedly as Kevin continued to cook. The silence between us was oddly comfortable, but there was an undercurrent of something I couldn't define. My fingers traced the edge of my mug, my mind reeling from yesterday's conversation, from his intense gaze, from the strange, lingering moments that had unsettled me. Then, as if he had read my thoughts, Kevin spoke again. "You've changed a lot since I last saw you," he said, his voice a little lower now. "You're more grown up, I guess." His words hit me harder than I expected. I looked up at him, trying to read his face. He wasn't smiling or looking at me in the same way he had the day before, but there was something in the way he spoke that felt off. It wasn't just a simple compliment, there was an underlying note of something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "You're not a little girl anymore," he added, his eyes meeting mine for a moment before shifting back to the pancakes. I felt a pang of discomfort. I hadn't expected his words to feel so unsettling. "I guess not," I said quietly, trying to brush it off. But the oddness of the moment lingered in the air, thick and palpable. Just then, my mom entered the kitchen, her footsteps light on the wooden floor. She greeted both of us with a smile and sat down beside me, but even her presence didn't seem to break the tension in the room. She looked between Kevin and me, her gaze lingering just a little too long, though she didn't say anything. It was as though she was studying us, trying to decipher something, and the feeling only added to the strangeness of the morning. I couldn't shake the thought that everything had shifted in some subtle, unspoken way. What had begun as a simple visit was starting to feel like something else entirely, something that I wasn't prepared for, but was quickly becoming impossible to ignore. The evening fell softly, wrapping the house in the quiet embrace of twilight. I sat on the porch, my mind still buzzing from the walk, from Kevin's words, and the unspoken tension that had followed me ever since. I tried to distract myself, staring at the horizon as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples, but it was no use. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me, the quiet hum of the house too loud in my ears. Kevin joined me on the porch after a while, his footsteps slow, as if he wasn't sure whether to approach or to retreat. He sat down beside me, the air between us thick and heavy. Neither of us spoke at first, but the silence was far from comfortable. It was as though everything in the world was on the edge of something about to break. He finally broke the stillness. "I need to tell you something." His voice was quiet, barely a murmur, but I could hear the urgency in it. The words were heavy, the weight of them pressing against my chest. I turned to look at him, my stomach dropping. "What is it?" Kevin seemed to hesitate, his hands fidgeting in his lap as if searching for the right way to say it. "I can't stop thinking about you. I've been trying to push it away, but it's been impossible. Every time I'm near you, it feels like I'm losing control." His voice cracked slightly, and I saw the vulnerability in his eyes, raw and unguarded. I froze. The world seemed to blur around me. I hadn't expected this, hadn't even considered it. The feelings I had been sensing, that strange shift in the air, suddenly came crashing down on me. But I wasn't sure if I was ready to face it. Was he talking about us, about what we had, or what we could have? Was he admitting something that could never be undone? "Kevin, you're my mom's partner," I whispered, though the words tasted bitter in my mouth. It felt like a betrayal just to say them, but there was no other way to put it. This can't happen." His expression faltered for a moment, but there was something in his eyes that made my heart ache. It was almost as if he were apologizing, but at the same time, his confession seemed to set something free inside him. "I know," he said, his voice quieter now but steady. "I know, and I don't want to hurt you. I never intended to feel this way, but I can't deny it anymore." His eyes searched mine, full of longing and regret. "You've changed. I've seen you grow, and it's been impossible not to notice. I never meant for this to happen, but I can't pretend it's not there anymore." I looked away, my hands trembling slightly in my lap. The words felt like they were suffocating me, spinning around in my mind, each one heavier than the last. He was right. Everything between us had changed. It wasn't just that I had grown older, had changed physically. It was something deeper, something unspoken. And now, he was telling me that he had been feeling it too, this thing I hadn't known how to name. "Kevin, you don't understand," I said, trying to hold my emotions in check. "This isn't just about us. It's about everything. About my mom, about our lives. We can't just undo everything." He leaned forward, his face inches from mine, and for a moment I could feel the heat of his breath on my skin. It made everything in me want to run, to push away from him, from this moment. But at the same time, I couldn't move. His gaze was fixed on mine, full of regret, but also something deeper, something that spoke of years of suppressed feelings. "I don't know what's right anymore," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can't pretend this isn't real. Can't pretend I don't feel it, and I think you feel it too." I closed my eyes, the weight of his words sinking into me like a stone, pulling me under. There was a truth in what he said, a truth I couldn't deny. Something had shifted, and the pieces were falling into place in ways I wasn't prepared for. But as much as I wanted to pull away, to tell him it was wrong, to scream that everything had to stay as it was, I couldn't. The feeling of his presence, the rawness of his confession, held me captive. "I think it's too late to fix this," I murmured, my voice breaking under the weight of what was happening. Kevin's expression softened, and for the first time, I saw the depth of the pain in his eyes, the realization that what we had shared was unraveling, piece by piece. And yet, in that moment, I wasn't sure if either of us wanted to stop it. The next morning arrived like a quiet storm, the kind that builds slowly, gradually, until you're standing in the middle of it, unable to escape. The house was still, the air heavy with the remnants of last night's conversation. I couldn't bring myself to look at Kevin. The words we had shared, the weight of them, pressed on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I felt suffocated by the distance that had formed between us, yet I didn't know how to bridge it. Kevin seemed to be carrying the same invisible burden. He avoided eye contact, and whenever our paths crossed in the hallway or kitchen, he said nothing. His silence spoke louder than anything he could have said, and I couldn't help but wonder, was this the moment everything would fall apart? Could things ever go back to what they had been before? I had hoped for some semblance of normalcy to return, but it was clear that it was no longer an option. The house felt different now, strangely cold, as if it were no longer a home, but just a place we happened to be. And I couldn't ignore the way my mom kept watching us, her gaze flicking from me to Kevin and back again, always lingering just a little too long, as if she sensed the shift but couldn't quite figure out what it meant. Later that morning, Kevin asked if I wanted to go back to the lake. The invitation hung in the air between us like an unspoken challenge. He didn't say it, but I could tell that he wanted to pretend that nothing had changed, that everything was still as it had been before the confession, before the weight of the silence had become unbearable. I stood at the doorway for a long moment, staring out into the yard, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I knew what he was asking. He was asking me to pretend, to ignore the reality of what had happened, to ignore the truth that had been laid bare between us. I knew that if I went with him, if I allowed myself to slip back into the comfort of those familiar routines, it would only make the distance between us grow wider, more painful. "I can't do this," I said quietly, more to myself than to him. Kevin's face fell, his expression crumpling with disappointment. But there was something else too, a hint of relief, like he had been waiting for me to say it. He had known, deep down, that this moment was inevitable, that we couldn't just continue pretending, not after everything. "You're right," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken regret. I don't know what I expected, but I knew from the moment I said it that there was no going back. We stood there, facing each other, the silence between us thick and suffocating. And in that silence, I realized just how much everything had changed. It wasn't just that we couldn't be together, though that was part of it. It was that the very foundation of what we had once shared had crumbled. What we had was no longer pure, no longer simple. It had been tainted by something unspoken, by something we couldn't undo. "I'm sorry," Kevin whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "I never wanted to hurt you." "I know," I said, though my voice felt distant, as if the words were coming from someone else. "But sometimes things just happen, and we can't control them." I turned away then, my heart pounding in my chest, but my feet carrying me in the opposite direction of him. I walked toward the house, each step feeling like a final severing of something that had once been a part of me. I could hear him behind me, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. It was done. There was no turning back. When I stepped inside, my mom was sitting in the living room, a cup of tea in her hands. Her eyes followed me as I walked in, but she said nothing. It was as though she already knew, and in that moment, I realized that I didn't have to say anything more. The truth was already out. The damage had been done, and it wasn't just between Kevin and me, it was between all of us. The house was quieter now, and I could feel the atmosphere shift once again. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. I sat down at the kitchen table, the room still and cold. I tried to make sense of it all, but I couldn't. How had we gotten here? And more importantly, what did this mean for the future? Later that day, as I walked outside to get some air, I noticed Kevin loading his things into his car. He didn't look at me as he worked, but I knew this was it, the final goodbye. The air felt sharp, like the last remnants of something that had once been alive had faded, leaving only the emptiness in its wake. Later that evening, as the darkness settled over the village and the lights inside the house flickered dimly, I found myself standing in the living room, unsure of what to do next. The house felt like a strange place now, like a memory I was trying to escape but couldn't. The weight of Kevin's confession still hung over me, filling the space with an unbearable tension. My mom was upstairs, probably lost in her own thoughts, and I could hear the faint sounds of movement from Kevin's room, the quiet rustling of bags being packed. It felt wrong to be so aware of everything around me, as if every sound, every movement, was a signal of something coming to an inevitable end. I knew it wasn't just Kevin and me, it was the whole thing. The illusion we had all been living in was crumbling, and no matter how hard we tried to hold on to it, it was slipping through our fingers. And then, Kevin appeared at the doorway, his face weary, his eyes filled with something I couldn't place. He stood there for a long moment, as if he was trying to find the right words, but when he spoke, his voice was filled with sadness. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his words soft but final. "I can't keep pretending like everything's fine. Not after what's happened." My heart twisted in my chest as I tried to swallow the lump in my throat. His confession was the closure I had been avoiding, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. "I know," I said, the words coming out almost like a sigh. It was the truth, though I had never wanted it to be. I had never wanted to be the one to break everything apart, to be the one to watch as it all shattered around me. But I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't keep living in the same house, pretending things hadn't changed. "It's better this way," I added, though the words felt hollow,